The Spy War, WW2's Most Dangerous Secret Agents. January 17, 1940. London. The air tasted of coal smoke and winter rain. In a cramped basement office beneath Baker Street, a man sat alone at a mahogany desk scarred by cigarette burns. His name was not spoken aloud, even among those who worked 3 floors above him. On the desk, a single manila folder, its contents classified beyond the reach of Parliament, beyond the knowledge of the War Cabinet, beyond the understanding of the generals planning their campaigns in marble halls. Inside that folder were 16 names. 16 civilians. A housewife from Lyon, a bicycle mechanic from Rotterdam, a university student from Warsaw. By the summer of 1945, 9 of them would be dead, their bodies never recovered, their sacrifices never acknowledged in any newspaper or memorial. But in that cold January moment, they were still alive, still unaware that they had been selected for a war that would be fought not with tanks or bombers, but with lies, codes, and the willingness to disappear. The Second World War would become famous for its beaches and its battles, its generals and its turning points, but beneath the surface of that conventional war, another conflict raged in silence. It was a shadow war, invisible to the newsreels, absent from the victory parades. It was fought in occupied cafes and neutral hotel lobbies, in the back rooms of embassies and the cellars of Gestapo headquarters. The soldiers wore no uniforms. Their weapons were forged documents, miniature cameras, cyanide capsules hidden inside fountain pens. They were spies, saboteurs, resistance organizers, men and women who walked through enemy territory carrying secrets that could alter the course of history. And if they were caught, they faced torture chambers, firing squads, and deaths so brutal that their handlers could only speak of them in whispers. This was the Spy War, and it was the most dangerous posting any human being could accept. By the winter of 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The Soviet Union had signed a pact with Hitler. America remained neutral, watching from across an ocean. The Wehrmacht controlled Europe from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees, and every week brought new reports of German divisions massing along the English Channel. In Whitehall, Winston Churchill understood a terrible truth. Britain could not defeat Nazi Germany through military strength alone. The British Army had been shattered at Dunkirk. The Royal Air Force was outnumbered. The Royal Navy could protect the islands, but it could not invade a continent. If Britain was to survive, if the war was to be won, it would require more than soldiers. It would require something unprecedented in the history of warfare, a vast covert network capable of sabotaging the enemy from within, of gathering intelligence from the heart of the Reich, of turning occupied Europe into a battlefield where every factory worker and railway clerk might become a weapon. And so, in July 1940, Churchill authorized the creation of a new organization. It was called the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, and its mandate was delivered in 3 words: set Europe ablaze. The SOE would recruit civilians, ordinary men and women with language skills, technical knowledge, or simply the courage to walk into hell, and transform them into agents capable of operating behind enemy lines. They would parachute into darkness, arriving in occupied France or Norway or Poland with nothing but forged papers, a radio transmitter, and instructions to organize resistance, sabotage infrastructure, and survive. The life expectancy of an SOE wireless operator in occupied France was 6 weeks. Every agent who volunteered knew this. They went anyway. But Britain was not alone in this shadow war. Across the Atlantic, even before Pearl Harbor, American intelligence officers were watching Europe with growing alarm. The United States had no centralized intelligence agency in 1940, no CIA, no National Spy Service. What it had was a patchwork of military attaches, FBI investigators, and a small office called the Coordinator of Information, led by a wealthy lawyer named William Wild Bill Donovan. Donovan understood, as Churchill did, that modern war would be decided not only by firepower, but by information. In June 1942, Roosevelt transformed Donovan's office into the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's first real intelligence agency. The OSS would operate in every theater of the war, from the jungles of Burma to the mountains of Yugoslavia, recruiting agents who could blend into enemy territory, organizing partisans, and executing missions so sensitive that even Eisenhower was not always informed of their details. And then there was the Soviet Union, whose intelligence apparatus dwarfed anything the Western Allies could imagine. The NKVD, precursor to the KGB, had been infiltrating foreign governments since the 1920s. Soviet spies sat in the British Foreign Office in the Manhattan Project, in the German High Command itself. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Stalin already possessed one of the most effective spy networks in the world. Soviet agents were not amateurs recruited for a single war. They were professionals, trained in Moscow, embedded for years or even decades. Some had never set foot in the Soviet Union. They were ideological converts, true believers in communism, willing to betray their own countries for a vision of a new world order. They were also, in many cases, the most successful spies of the entire war. The Germans and Japanese, of course, had their own intelligence services. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, operated across Europe and North Africa. The Gestapo and the SD hunted resistance fighters and enemy agents with methodical brutality. In Japan, the Kempeitai, the military police, combined intelligence gathering with savage counterinsurgency operations in occupied China and Southeast Asia. But both the Axis powers suffered from a fatal flaw. They were fighting defensive intelligence wars. Germany and Japan were conquering empires, and their intelligence agencies focused on rooting out enemies within occupied territories. The Allies, by contrast, were insurgents, and their spies were offensive weapons designed to penetrate, disrupt, and destroy from within. Consider the case of Virginia Hall. Born in Baltimore, Maryland, she was a woman who should never have become a spy. She had lost her left leg in a hunting accident before the war and walked with a pronounced limp, relying on a wooden prosthesis she called Cuthbert. She was an American civilian living in France when the Germans invaded. She could have fled to safety. Instead, she volunteered. The British SOE sent her back into occupied France in August 1941, where she posed as an American journalist, traveling through Vichy territory, organizing resistance cells, arranging weapons drops, and rescuing downed Allied pilots. The Gestapo knew her only as the Limping Lady, the most dangerous Allied agent in France. They searched for her for 2 years. In November 1942, when the Germans occupied Vichy France, Virginia Hall escaped over the Pyrenees into Spain, hiking through mountain snowfields on her wooden leg. The OSS recruited her immediately, trained her in advanced tradecraft, and sent her back into France in March 1944, just 3 months before D-Day. This time, she went in by boat, landing on a deserted beach in Brittany. For the next 4 months, she coordinated resistance operations, called in airstrikes, and helped arm the Maquis fighters who would rise up on D-Day to attack German supply lines. The Germans never caught her. After the war, she received the Distinguished Service Cross, the only female civilian in the war to be so honored. She did not attend the ceremony. Spies, even in peacetime, avoided public recognition. Or take the story of Richard Sorge, perhaps the most successful spy in history, and certainly the most tragic. Sorge was a German communist who had fled to the Soviet Union in the 1920s. The NKVD recruited him, gave him a new identity, and sent him to Japan in 1933, where he posed as a loyal Nazi journalist. Over the next 8 years, Sorge built a spy ring that penetrated the highest levels of the German embassy in Tokyo and the Japanese government. In June 1941, he sent a message to Moscow warning that Germany would invade the Soviet Union within weeks. Stalin ignored the warning, convinced it was disinformation. In October 1941, Sorge sent another message, perhaps the most important intelligence report of the entire war. Japan would not attack the Soviet Union. Instead, it would strike south, against the United States and Britain. This intelligence allowed Stalin to transfer 20 divisions from Siberia to the defense of Moscow. Those divisions arrived just in time to stop the Wehrmacht at the gates of the capital. Sorge's intelligence may have saved the Soviet Union. But in October 1941, Japanese counterintelligence arrested him, He was tortured, tried, and hanged in November 1944. Stalin never acknowledged his existence, not even to save his life. The agents expected glory, perhaps, or at least the satisfaction of clear victories. They expected to be heroes in a righteous cause, to strike blows that would shorten the war and save lives. What they experienced instead was ambiguity, loneliness, and moral compromise. They lived under false identities, unable to trust anyone, unable to contact their families, knowing that a single mistake, a misremembered detail in their cover story, a slight accent, a forged document with the wrong stamp, could lead to arrest, torture, and execution. They lied to everyone, including the people they recruited, the resistance fighters who trusted them, the civilians who sheltered them. They carried cyanide capsules not because they feared death, but because they feared what they might say under torture. Many of them broke. Some betrayed their networks. A few defected. The war destroyed their peacetime selves, and for many, there was no returning to who they had been before. The historical record is littered with their ghosts. Noor Inayat Khan, a British Asli agent and Sufi Muslim, parachuted into France in June 1943 as a wireless operator. She was a poet, a children's book author, a woman who had lived a life of pacifism and spirituality. She lasted 4 months. The Gestapo arrested her in October 1943, betrayed by a French collaborator. They sent her to Pforzheim prison in Germany, where she was kept in chains in solitary confinement for 10 months. In September 1944, she was transferred to Dachau concentration camp and shot in the back of the head. Her last word was Liberté. The Gestapo burned her body. There is no grave. Odette Sansom, another Asli agent, was arrested in France in April 1943 along with her network organizer, Peter Churchill. The Gestapo tortured her, pulling out her toenails, burning her back with a hot iron. They told her that Peter Churchill had betrayed her. She told them nothing. She pretended to be Peter Churchill's wife, hoping the Germans would treat her as a prisoner of war rather than a spy. They sent her to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she was kept in a punishment cell, in darkness, for 2 years. She survived because the camp commandant believed she was related to Winston Churchill and kept her alive as a potential bargaining chip. She was not related to Churchill. The lie saved her life. After the war, she received the George Cross. She lived until 1995, long enough to see the world forget the war her generation had fought in silence. The men fared no better. Tommy Yo Thomas, a British Asli agent known as the White Rabbit, was captured in France in March 1944. The Gestapo tortured him for days, trying to break him, to force him to reveal his networks. He told them nothing. They sent him to Buchenwald concentration camp, where he was marked for execution. He escaped by switching identities with a dead prisoner, then survived the camp by working in the crematorium, burning the bodies of murdered inmates. He was liberated in April 1945, weighing 80 pounds, half-blind from malnutrition. He, too, received the George Cross. He spent the rest of his life plagued by nightmares, by survivor's guilt, by the knowledge that he had lived while so many of his comrades had not. The symbolic object of this shadow war was not a weapon or a flag. It was a suitcase. The Spies' suitcase, battered and ordinary, the kind a traveling salesman might carry. Inside, a radio transmitter, crystals, a Morse code key, a coil of antenna wire. The suitcase was heavy, 30 pounds or more, and agents carried it through train stations, past German checkpoints, into safe houses that might be raided at any moment. The suitcase was their lifeline, their only connection to London or Washington or Moscow. Every night, in attics and cellars and forest clearings, they set up their radios and tapped out messages in code, sending intelligence reports, requesting supplies, confirming sabotage operations. And every night, the Gestapo listened, using radio direction-finding equipment to triangulate their signals, closing in street by street, building by building. Wireless operators learned to transmit in bursts, 5 minutes or less, then pack up and move. Even so, the Gestapo caught them. In Paris alone, The Germans arrested more than 60 SW wireless operators between 1941 and 1944. Most of them were executed. The transformation came not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small betrayals of the self. Agents learned to watch people with suspicion, to analyze every conversation for hidden meanings, to trust no one completely. They learned to kill, not in the heat of battle but coldly, with a knife or a silenced pistol, and to walk away without looking back. They learned to live with fear, not the sharp fear of combat but the grinding, constant fear of discovery, a fear that never slept, that turned every footstep behind them into a potential arrest, every knock on the door into a death sentence. And they learned that the war they were fighting had no front lines, no truces, no rules. The Geneva Convention did not apply to spies. If they were captured out of uniform, carrying false papers, they were not soldiers but criminals, subject to torture and execution. They knew this. They accepted it. And they went anyway because someone had to, because the war could not be won without them, because they believed, despite everything, that their sacrifice might matter. The evidence is carved into the walls of prisons and concentration camps across Europe. At Frasnes prison outside Paris, you can still see the scratched initials of SW agents awaiting execution. At Ravensbrück, there is a memorial to the women who were shot or gassed or worked to death. At Flossenburg concentration camp in Bavaria, a plaque commemorates the execution of several Abwehr officers who had turned against Hitler, including Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, who was hanged in April 1945, just days before the camp was liberated. Canaris had spent years secretly protecting Jews, sabotaging Nazi policies, and passing intelligence to the Allies. He died because he believed Germany had lost its soul, and he could not serve the regime any longer. The Nazis hanged him with piano wire, slowly, so that he would strangle rather than break his neck. It took half an hour. The great sabotage operations of the war were made possible by these networks of spies. In February 1943, Norwegian commandos trained by the SOE destroyed the Vemork heavy water plant in occupied Norway, crippling Germany's atomic weapons program. The commandos were guided by intelligence provided by local resistance members who had been watching the plant for months, counting guards, mapping patrols, identifying vulnerabilities. In June 1944, French resistance fighters, armed and coordinated by SW and OSS agents, launched thousands of sabotage attacks across France in support of the D-Day landings. They cut rail lines, blew up bridges, ambushed German convoys, and delayed the arrival of Wehrmacht reinforcements by days or even weeks. The British 6th Airborne Division, which landed in Normandy on D-Day with the mission of capturing key bridges, succeeded in part because French resistance fighters had already cut German communication lines, leaving the defenders isolated and confused. In the Pacific, American intelligence achieved perhaps the greatest coup of the war, the breaking of Japanese naval codes. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the Japanese battle plan in advance, knew the exact location and timing of the attack because Navy cryptanalysts had deciphered Japanese radio traffic. The Americans ambushed the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 aircraft carriers and turning the tide of the Pacific War. But the code-breaking operation depended on more than mathematicians in Hawaii. It depended on coast watchers scattered across the Pacific Islands, Australian and American agents who hid in the jungle, radioing warnings when Japanese ships or planes passed overhead. It depended on capture documents, codebooks salvaged from sunken submarines, intelligence pieced together from 100 tiny fragments. And it depended on absolute secrecy. The Americans never revealed that they had broken Japanese codes, not even when it might have saved lives, because preserving the secret was more valuable than winning any single battle. The Japanese learned this lesson too late. In April 1943, American intelligence intercepted and decrypted a Japanese radio message detailing the travel itinerary of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. President Roosevelt personally authorized an ambush. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters intercepted Yamamoto's plane over Bougainville and shot it down. Yamamoto's death was a devastating blow to Japanese morale, but it also alerted the Japanese that their codes might be compromised. They changed their ciphers, forcing American cryptanalysts to start over. But by then it was too late. The Americans had already won Midway, and the Japanese Navy would never recover. The Soviets, for their part, ran one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the war from the heart of Switzerland, a neutral country surrounded by Axis territory. Rudolf Rössler, a German publisher who had fled to Switzerland in the 1930s, ran a network codenamed Lucy that provided the Soviet Union with real-time intelligence on German military operations. Rössler's sources inside the German High Command were so well-placed that Soviet commanders sometimes received German attack plans before they reached the Wehrmacht officers who would execute them. At the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, Soviet forces were dug in and waiting because Lucy had provided advance warning of the German offensive. The Germans lost. The Eastern Front turned. Hitler never again launched a strategic offensive in the East. But even Lucy's intelligence came at a cost. After the war, it was revealed that one of Rössler's key sources was a group of German officers who opposed Hitler and were leaking intelligence to the Soviets in hopes of hastening Germany's defeat. They were never caught during the war, but they lived in constant fear, knowing that discovery meant not just execution but torture, the arrest of their families, the destruction of everyone they loved. They were committing treason, and they knew it, and they did it anyway because they believed that Germany under Hitler was worse than Germany defeated. By the summer of 1944, the spy war had reached a terrible crescendo. In France, the Gestapo was arresting resistance members by the hundreds, rounding up entire networks, torturing suspects to extract the names of their contacts. In Poland, the Soviet NKVD was purging Polish resistance fighters who might oppose Soviet control after the war. In Yugoslavia, British and American liaison officers were embedded with Tito's communist partisans, even as they watched those same partisans execute political rivals and prepare for a post-war dictatorship. The moral clarity of 1940 had given way to the brutal pragmatism of 1944. The Allies were winning, but the cost was becoming visible in the mass graves and burned villages and shattered agents who returned from occupied territory with haunted eyes and stories they would never tell. And then the war ended. May 8, 1945, in Europe. August 15, 1945, in the Pacific. The soldiers came home to parades and medals and public gratitude. The spies came home to silence. Most of them could never speak of what they had done, not for years, sometimes not for decades. The operations remained classified. The networks were kept intact in case of a new war with the Soviet Union. The agents returned to civilian life, to jobs in banks and schools and government offices, and they carried their secrets like scars. Some of them drank. Some of them suffered from what would later be called PTSD, but in 1945 had no name at all. Some of them simply disappeared, unable to reintegrate into a world that had no idea what they had sacrificed. Virginia Hall went to work for the CIA, the successor to the OSS, and spent the Cold War running agents in Europe. She never married. She died in 1982, and her obituary in the New York Times was 8 paragraphs long, far too short to contain the life she had lived. Odette Sansom became a public figure after the war, speaking about her experiences, but she always said that the real heroes were the ones who did not come back. Tommy Yo Thomas worked in business and tried to forget the war. He died in 1964, and his funeral was attended by a handful of men and women who had no need to explain to each other why they wept. Richard Sorge's existence was not officially acknowledged by the Soviet Union until 1964, nearly 20 years after his execution. In 1965, the Soviets issued a postage stamp in his honor, calling him a hero of the Soviet Union. It was too late. Noor Inayat Khan's body was never recovered. There is a statue of her in London now, a bronze woman in a flight suit, gazing east toward the continent she died trying to free. Tourists walk past it every day, most of them unaware of who she was or what she did. The epilogue of the spy war is written not in monuments or memorials, but in the margins of history, in the footnotes of declassified documents, in the quiet graves scattered across Europe. The spies did not win the war alone, but the war could not have been won without them. They gathered the intelligence that guided the bombers, that planned the invasions, that broke the enemy's codes and sabotaged his factories and delayed his reinforcements. They paid for it with their lives, with their sanity, with their ability to ever again live without looking over their shoulders. They walked into darkness carrying nothing but false names and the hope that their sacrifice might mean something, might tip the balance, might save lives they would never meet. And in the end, that is what they did. Every sabotaged rail line shortened the war by hours. Every stolen document saved lives on the battlefield. Every resistance network that rose up on D-Day hastened the liberation of Europe. The spies knew they might not live to see victory. Most of them did not expect to. They went anyway because freedom is not defended only on battlefields, and because the wars that matter most are not always the ones that history remembers. They were ordinary people who chose to become ghosts, to erase themselves so that others might live in a world worth living in. They succeeded. And then they vanished, into files marked secret, into memories too painful to speak aloud, into the unmarked graves of a war that was fought in whispers and won in silence. The suitcase remains, in museums now, behind glass. 30 pounds of metal and wire and crystal oscillators, the tool that connected the occupied to the free, the weapon that turned housewives and mechanics and students into the most dangerous soldiers of the war. Look at it long enough, and you can almost hear the tapping of the Morse code key, the dots and dashes spelling out coordinates and warnings and pleas for help. Listen closely, and you might hear the voices of the men and women who carried it through checkpoints and train stations and forests at night, who set it up in attics while the Gestapo listened below, who sent their messages and packed up and moved before the radio direction finders could triangulate their position. They are gone now, nearly all of them, but the suitcase remains, a relic of a war fought by people whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see, whose courage we can only imagine from a distance of decades, and the safety of a world they died to create. They were spies. They were heroes. And they won a war that no one saw them fight.